So thanks, it's wonderful to be here. I'm sorry I have to flee very quickly. My 5-year-old daughter spent the whole morning bawling about the fact that I was leaving, and I promised I would be back in time tonight to put her to bed, so that's why I have to speak and run, not because I'm afraid of your reaction, as much as I'm afraid of her reaction if I don't get home. So here we go. Is this up on the screen yet somewhere, or just in my head? Hello, tech team. That's me, as you can see, but that's not my slide. We're here. Great. Okay, number one. So I want to talk a little bit about a person we never talk about anymore, the anti-democrat, the person who doesn't like democracy, who's against it, right? I want to think a little bit about what we could say the plight of the modern anti-democrat, right? Because there used to be a time when things were great for the anti-democrat. 200 years ago, this is the number of democracies that there were in the world. But today, the number looks something like this, which leads the anti-democrat to be very sad. That's the first time I've ever used a smiley in anything I've ever done, right there. Okay, but the point is that the anti-democrat has actually been helped by a very important philosopher, maybe America's most important philosopher, a philosopher who lived about 3.5 miles away from here in the southeast of Manhattan, Cherry Street philosopher, a guy named Boss Tweed. And what Boss Tweed used to say is, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. So this figure, this character, this modern American vision of what democracy is supposed to be is a democracy that we could think of as tweedism. And tweedism works like this. Any democracy where there's basically 2 stages to the election, one, the nominating stage, which the Tweeds control, and second, the electing stage, where all citizens get to participate. Tweedism produces a filter in the middle there. And the filter has a consequence. The consequence is obviously to produce a system responsive to the Tweeds only. That's what I mean by tweedism. Now, we can think of lots of examples of tweedism, a bunch of them pretty crude. Think about Iran. Iran has a, quote, democracy. They have an election every cycle. The election, citizens get to vote. But to be able to run in the election, the Guardian Council must select you. The Guardian Council says to run, you must do well with them. So 12 people get to select the people that 50 million people will vote among. Same thing in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union used to have something they called a democracy. The election where all citizens got to vote was set up by the Politburo, where the commies got to vote. The commies selected the candidates who could run in that election. So about 19 people would select the candidates that 270 million would get to vote among. That was tweedism. But it's a little bit too extreme for modern times. No democracy runs itself quite like that. In America, we had a different kind of tweedism for many years. In Texas in 1923, for example, the Texas legislature passed a law that said in the Democratic primary, and there was only one party really in Texas back then, the Democratic Party, in the Democratic primary, only whites could vote, an all-white primary. So that there was a 2-stage election in Texas, the general election where everybody got to vote, the primary where only whites got to vote. To be able to run in the general election, you had to do well in that primary, a 2-stage election where 16% of the population was excluded in that critical first step, with the obvious consequence of producing a democracy responsive to the whites only. Now, even that kind of tweedism is a little too crude. Nobody would quite get away with that today. So think about the explosion of protest in Hong Kong last summer. Students and then eventually their parents showed up in the hundreds of thousands to protest a law. The law was, as the description was, the aim was the ultimate selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. So this committee would be comprised of 1,200 citizens, which means out of 7 million is about 0.02% of Hong Kong that would get to select the candidates that the rest of the country could vote among. Now, 0.02% is a really small number. See, really, really small. If we thought about its proportion relating to the other citizens of Hong Kong, it would look something like this. That's what 0.02% looks like. So in this tweedist system, this tiny, tiny fraction got to select the candidates that the rest of the citizens got to vote among, producing a filter, a biased filter, because the perception was this 0.02% would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite, 99.98% excluded from this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, of a democracy responsive to China only. Now, that form of tweedism is a little too clever. But the one I want to focus on today, I want you to think about, to recognize today, comes from my own country, where you are now, the United States. We take it for granted in the United States that campaigns will be privately funded. But we need to see the way funding is its own kind of contest. Funding is its own primary. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars, raising money to fund their campaigns or to get their party back into power. And as they do this, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but in issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes how when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, you know, he was not an environmentalist. So B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is the picture of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson learns which buttons he needs to push to get the sustenance he or her party needs to survive. This is a primary too. It's the money primary. It's not a white primary, it's a green primary. It's one stage in a multi-stage election that establishes the candidates who are credible, who are allowed to run in the general election. And so when we think about it like this, it's obviously important to think about who the funders are. In 2014, 5.4 million Americans gave even $1 to a congressional campaign. That's about 1.7% of America. But the biggest funders obviously gave a lot more than the average. The top 100 gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million contributors to congressional campaigns. But if we think about those who we could call the relevant funders, people who give enough to matter, people who give enough so that their views are what the candidates are thinking about as the candidates are trying to figure, how do I raise money? Who are the relevant funders? Well, let's just pick a number. Let's say people who give $5,200 or more. Now, $5,200 turns out to be the maximum amount you can give to one candidate in the election cycle. 2 cycles, you've got a primary and a general, you can give a total of $5,200. Turns out in 2014, 57,874 Americans gave $5,200. And for those of you doing the numbers, you'll recognize 57,854 Americans is 0.02% of America. 0.02%, you remember that number. That's the same number as the number who get to nominate the candidates who run in Hong Kong. 0.02% defines, at least, at most think that's even too generous, at most, the people who are determining the people who get to run that the rest of us get to vote among. 0.02%, a tiny fraction of the 1%, a Chinese fraction of the 1% dominating this first stage, with the consequence, obviously, when 99.98% are excluded from this critical first stage, the consequence is a democracy responsive to the funders only. There's a study from Princeton, which is a Harvard professor I'm not allowed to talk about much, so I'll put it off the stage quickly, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page, the largest empirical study of actual policy decisions by our government in the history of political science, relating those actual decisions made to the attitudes of the economic elite, organized business groups, and average voter. What they found for the economic elite was this: as the percentage of the economic elite supporting something goes from 0 to 100, the probability of that thing getting enacted goes up. Same thing for organized interest groups. As the number of groups supporting something goes from a small number to a large number, the probability of that idea being passed goes up. That's the relationship you expect in a democracy. The more someone likes something, the more likely it is it will get passed. Here's the graph for the average voter. It's a flat line, literally and figuratively, a flat line. What this is saying is as the percentage of average voters supporting an idea goes from 0 to 100, the probability that that idea gets enacted into law does not change at all. As they put it in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy. That is the relation, right? This is the picture we were given of what our democracy was supposed to be, right? Here we are in the middle, we the people in the middle, like driving the bus. This is the theory. This is the reality of that picture. That the steering wheel has come disconnected from the wheels because we have no actual control, average citizens, over which way this bus drives. This is too real a description of the way this democracy has evolved. That's tweedism. Okay. Now the thing about tweedism that's relevant to a group like this is that the tweedism we can think of as the anti-democrat's principle. Right? It's the thing that animates what it is to be an anti-democrat, and it's the opposite principle to the principle of the net. So if tweedism is on one side, it stands against really important principles that have come to define what we think of as the values or the principles of the net. Tweedism is about concentrated power. The principles of the net are about diffuse power. They're both about power, but the question is how that power manifests itself and has its effect. And the challenge we face with respect to this particular threat, the anti-democratic threat that America faces today, is how to use diffuse power to diffuse power. And I think the critical recognition is that the dynamic that makes that possible in the context of the net is this naive dynamic of hope. Right? Think about the way we go through a successful Kickstarter campaign. It starts with an absolutely impossible ask, and it gets kicked into success when the impossible task begins to seem possible. It goes from impossible to possible, and that gives the energy that drives it to its success. And we start with this debate in a completely impossible position. We did this poll at the end of last year. We asked, how important is it to you that the influence of money in politics be reduced? 96% of Americans said it was important. So that means Republicans too, right? 96% say it's important. But in the next question we asked, how likely do you think it is that the influence of money in politics will be reduced? And 91% said it was not likely. Right, so just like 96% of us wish we could fly like Superman, but because 91% of us are pretty convinced we don't leap off of tall buildings regularly, this is the politics of resignation. We accept the reality that there's nothing we can do because we're convinced there's nothing we can do. We're convinced that this is impossible. There's no hope here. It is hopeless. And the challenge is to find a way to invigorate, give people a sense that there is hope. Now, the truth is the net has done limited versions of this so far. The net has stopped lots of bad stuff. SOPA, PIPA, the most dramatic recent example. And it, in fact, has passed some stuff in regulatory agencies, like net neutrality, that it effectively got passed in the FCC. But what the net has not yet done is find a way to pass affirmatively some substantial reform in the context of Congress. It has not done that yet, but if we're to restore this conception of democracy, it's got to do it soon. Thanks very much. So we're going to... Sorry? Great, beautiful.
May I introduce you to Anke Domscheit-Berg? She is the German internet activist. She is a wonderful friend. She belongs to the DLD community, and she really makes a difference in Germany in terms of freedom of the internet. Is this okay?
Yeah, yeah. I hope so. Larry, I think we can summarize your talk in short, in plain English, as democracy is fucked up. I'd like to add some thoughts to that. Some of you probably know that I grew up in East Germany, and when the Berlin Wall fell, I was 21 years old. And when I was living behind the Iron Curtain, I had quite a precise idea of what makes a democracy a democracy. And this was free, equal elections. And I think we understood that that's no longer the case, at least not here in this system. I expected from a democracy that there is no torture and no death penalty. And I only say things like Guantanamo, drone strikes, police force against black people, etc. So probably no check mark there neither. I expected protected communications, privacy. I expected to be considered innocent until proven guilty. But we all know that we live today in a situation, and not only in the United States, same is true for Germany, where we are under surveillance again. And this feels very strange for me, because it's not just a rational thing. It feels like in '89. The big difference being that at that time, I was living in a totalitarian state, and it was not really a surprise. But now I do live, or I thought I live, in a democracy. And on all those major points, what I considered as an East German to make up a democracy, I see today a big fail. And the big question I would now like to pose and discuss is, what do we do about it? So I doubt there is no real anti-democrat in this room, so we have to find answers to that.
Yeah, I think the most difficult challenge is to find a way to steer not all the creative energy that goes into the amazing things that the net builds, but I'm arguing for like tithing, like 10% of the creative energy that goes into making the net and all these amazing environments as incredible as they are, towards the idea of making sane government possible again. Because what I experienced when I lived in Silicon Valley for 9 years, and I think many people have commented on this, is the frustration with the failure of government leads sane, talented people to just ignore the problem and to go off and do their own stuff. Well, that's fine until it's no longer fine, because we can't address any important problem that we face if we don't have a sane government. So the real pitch is, how do you inspire people to use the amazing techniques that are developing in the context of the net to help us recover something of what sane government could be? And I don't know the answer to that yet. I thought you guys had that answer.
I mean, some things seem to be easier with the internet, and this is preventing something bad from happening.
Yep.
Maybe not so easy to get rid of such an electoral system, but we know that it's pretty easy to mobilize people against something with means of the internet, social media, etc. Even police force is now harder because we have the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and people start to look at these things. We have prevented SOPA, PIPA, ACTA, and hopefully we will prevent something like TTIP as it is defined right now too. So this seems easier, but what I consider really difficult, and I think we agree on that, is how do you use the force of the digital to bring people together to develop something, a consensus, create an idea, and then together fight for this vision. It's so much harder than preventing something from happening. Saying no is easier than saying jointly yes to something. And what we should somehow work on together, and maybe somebody here in this room can help do this, is develop tools, new tools for democracy, which help us develop this type of consensus. We are lacking these tools. It's not an easy task to do. What we also lack is public platforms. It's very nice that government authorities come along and make online town hall meetings, but why on earth do they have to take place on Facebook or Google? Why don't we have any public digital space where we can do those discussions on a neutral level? These are lacking too. And coming back to surveillance, billions and billions are invested to spy on people. And if you haven't noticed today, followed the news, the Federal Court of Appeal has declared the spying on metadata on American citizens to be illegal and not being conform with Patriot Act, just to let you know. So, yeah, I think that's worth an applause. So if we have all these billions to do this, why not invest some public money? And we can lobby for this, to develop tools and public platforms where we can together maybe work constructively towards a better democracy again.
Yeah, and I think that would be great, but I think what makes it not likely is an environment where government is so obsessively concerned with how to keep the anti-democrat happy, the tweed happy. So, you know, keeping the tweed happy involves making sure that free and fair elections don't happen easily. It involves making sure that most people feel so cynical and disconnected from government, they have no reason to show up to even vote.
Yeah, we see that.
And so this is why, you know, I think there's a whole list of reforms that democracy needs. But we got to think of the generative reforms. We got to think of the reforms that are platform reforms that would enable a whole bunch of other reforms to happen. And that's why I've spent the last 8 years since Aaron Swartz sort of shamed me into it, focusing on what I think is the core root to this problem. And that is in America, not everywhere in the world, but in America, the root to this problem of corruption is the way we fund campaigns. It's an obvious, once you see it, it's kind of obvious. This is the way that corruption is affected. You sort of train these Congress people to spend all their time, you know, dipping in to try to get the money from this tiny fraction. Not surprising, they therefore are responsive to that tiny fraction. Until we can motivate people to do something about that, nothing else will be possible. And I agree with you, we haven't seen it yet, but what I think is exciting, the reason I'm actually hopeful about this, is that if you think about the kind of rhythms of activism over the past 10, 15 years, they've become the kind of amplitude and the kind of the power of them has grown, and I think that not without any like director or conductor or central leadership project, I think more and more people are learning how to coordinate and to coordinate in a kind of rather regular rhythm of putting pressure on for reform. I think, you know, SOPA PIPA was amazing in the United States. I think the FCC network neutrality interventions was even more amazing. It was more extensive. It was more dramatic because it was such an obscure topic for anybody to even get. Yet, you know, they produced millions of interventions to try to get the right policy there. And I think if we can learn from how that's happening, there's a chance of training that power against what I think is ultimately the root problem here.
I think what we can really say is that it's a very hard fight requiring all of us, because we are actually asking the fish to dry out the pond, which is not an easy thing to achieve. So those who are in power and can change the system are those who benefit from the current system, and that really makes it particularly hard.
That's true, although, you know, I'm a big spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union and the post-Soviet countries, and I think these analogies are really informative. I actually think we're sort of circa the Soviet Union 1987, in the sense that this system is not sustainable. People inside of Washington are miserable with their life. Congressmen hate the way the system is. Like, there's nobody who likes it except the people who profit from it, and they're very powerful, but they're not a majority, right? So I think it's actually at an unstable point. And the hope is that, especially in this election cycle, as this issue is flaring up in spades, there's a chance to finally focus energy in a way that could actually make progress.
So you see a tipping point possible.
Yes, absolutely.
But that does require all of us. This is, you mentioned the end of the 80s again, so that's my final sentence, because I know you have to rush. Something I learned in '89 was democracy does not come as a gift. You really have to fight for it, for those freedom rights. What I now learned, 25 years later, it does not stay.
Yes.
You really have to fight for it to stay true to its own values, because otherwise it's no longer a democracy. And you wake up one morning and it's gone, and then it's much harder to fight for it, I can tell you, from own experience. So I hope we all take this home as a responsibility, and it doesn't matter in what aspect you are here, whether it be professional, for personal interest, whether you are just a digital private person or engaged in an organization. This is a fight. We all are in the same boat, and we all have to row in order not to be pushed back on this river. So let's do it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.